Hey guys, this week we're going to be taking a look at bias that is automatically present in reporting. No matter how much someone may want to write an unbiased article, a representation of what they see as news, you're always going to have in there your personal opinions and worldviews are going to come out in one way, shape, or form. And it's our job as readers to identify that, knowing that this is going on and being able to recognize it and filter what we read and see and hear accordingly. So there are many different ways to tell the same story, and we're going to be looking at that in a comparison of articles when we finish this. You're going to be looking at the same article coming from three different sources, one with a more liberal stance, one with a more conservative stance, and one that sort of tries to balance the two, but even then it doesn't completely succeed. But you're going to be looking at the same article written from these different perspectives. So there's many different ways to tell the same story. And one of the major building blocks of doing this is the words we use. You'll see it in the words of the article, you'll see it in the words of the headline, and that's the first thing I want you to focus on is the words that an author uses in their article. And sometimes it can just be a few words that cue us in. Sometimes it can be entire sentences that let us know that there is bias occurring in this article. And sometimes bias can be for a group or against a group or an idea. So what we want to look at is key questions to ask when looking at word choices. First one, what is the fundamental piece of information being presented? Take out all the extras, what's really happening? And then the second, is there an easier way, a less insulting way, a less biased way to present that information? So here we're going to look at two articles, one from the New York Times and one from USA Today. They're older articles, but the principle still holds true. It just does a nice job here of showing that word usage. So we're going to look strictly at the headlines here. The New York Times, Iraq forces suspension of U.S. surveillance flights. We don't gather a whole lot there, but we know what's happening. The second one, UN withdraws U-2 planes. Both of them are pretty concise to the point. If we look here, the word choice, when we're looking here, surveillance flights were ended. It's usually the case in journalism that more than one bit of information is put into a title. So we're looking here, not only was it the suspension of flights, but more particularly the suspension of surveillance flights. However, you can see that it is altered from the same idea. So this is going to be depicted in two different ways. So we read here, Iraqi fighter jets threatened two American U-2 surveillance planes, forcing them to return to abort their mission and return to base. That's coming from the New York Times. Then we read the same exact incident from USA Today. Arms inspectors said Tuesday they had withdrawn two U-2 reconnaissance planes over Iraq for safety reasons after Baghdad complained both aircraft were in the air simultaneously. So this is the same article taking from two different perspectives, two different biases, and you can see it in the words here. Here we've got fighter jets threatened two American U-2 surveillance planes. And here we have, instead of surveillance, we've got reconnaissance planes. And here we see the words safety reasons and Baghdad complained. So looking at what the author is really trying to say between those two articles. This one's a little bit more interesting, using sports information, and sports writers oftentimes are much more biased in their perspective than any others, and they're allowed to be. That is the thing with sports. You go in understanding a sports writer wants their team to win, is going to show their team in the best possible light. But you can look here how local coverage affects the way a story is written. Here in the Denver Post, injuries begin the Avs tumble. This is the Avalanche. It's a hockey team, a local hockey team for Denver. So injury begins, Avs tumble. And then the second article coming from Detroit, the Red Wings are from Detroit. The Wings are too much for the Avalanche. So you can see, depending on the local swing of the event, how it can change the bias. Here, it looks like, an injury is what caused the loss. here in the Detroit News, they're clearly stating that their team is superior. So you can see the bias in that very clearly in their word choice. Now, again, here comes another one looking at word choices here in the St. Petersburg Times, so it's a Florida newspaper looking at what was happening in Iraq, versus the Dar el-Hayat, which is a local paper in the Arab world. So you've got a U.S. paper and an Arab paper, both talking about the war that was happening in Iraq. So here in the St. Petersburg Times, the Florida, the U.S. paper, it calls us U.S.-led coalition forces. Here in the Middle East paper, U.S.-led invasion forces. So you can see the take on it based on the location of the source to the proximity of the event. So American sources labeled it as the war in Iraq, and Arab sources called it the war on Iraq. So just that little preposition in the center of that phrase changes the whole understanding. Here comes another example here. It's an article that occurred in 2003, and President Bush wrote a legal brief to the court talking about what was happening at the University of Michigan, getting rid of the affirmative action that the suit that was filed. And then this is the blurb that was written about it. I want you to notice the wording. Democrats who are planning to seek Mr. Bush's job, and then it goes on to list them, Lieberman, Kerry, Edwards, Gerhardt, Governor Dean, express their dismay at Bush's remarks. Well, they come out right away and tell you the bias in here. Democrats who are planning to seek Mr. Bush's job. What if they had just instead said leading Democrats? Would you have seen their response a little differently? Or what if they didn't even put what political party they were from? Others in the Senate disagreed with President Bush and simply listed it there. This here more clearly states the bias, though. You've got an opposite political party and individuals who are looking for President Bush's job. So word choice is very, very important. Another important element in identifying bias is not only what is written, but what is not written. It's called the omissions. In other words, what did the author leave out? So what you're going to be doing here is when you compare articles, sorry, it just moved. We're going to be looking at two articles here. You can read through them in their entirety. I'm just going to go through them rather quickly here. Both on the same ideas, but again, taking different perspectives. The first one, Los Angeles Times, 59% of school children surveyed say handguns are easy to get. And then here, student poll finds many using guns. Now, the question we need to ask is what was omitted in these articles? And when you look on this, they are using statistics. They rely very heavily on statistics. But one of the things they also rely very heavily on is polling. And polling has a margin of error anywhere between 3 to 5%, although after past election problems, the polling seems to be much higher. And also when polling, the questions can be purposely written to lead people to answer in a particular way. For example, somebody might ask, when was the last time you beat your wife? And so you have to answer it in a way. It's like, well, I never beat my wife, but that's not one of the polling answers. So let me choose one of these that I can pick. And so if you're reading an article and they do not have the direct polling question that was asked, automatically regard their poll with suspicion because you have no way to back up whether or not what they asked was misleading in the first place. So now here are two articles. One is real, one was made up. This one here was written after the Challenger explosion in 1996. And this one here is a fake article. What if it had been written differently at this point in time about the Challenger explosion? In other words, if people had questioned what was happening in the space program and problems within the space program at that point in time, would there have even occurred such a disaster? Because when you look through these articles, a lot of their sources are only those government officials. They're not looking to outside sources. If all your sources are coming from one place, you need to be a little bit more suspicious about the article. So what's being omitted as far as sources? Who is not being credited? Who is not being spoken about? Another element of bias in the media comes from limiting debate. So in other words, when we look at limiting a debate, the first casualty in war is often truth. And this may seem very unpatriotic to challenge a government in the time of war and what they're telling us, but we need to do so. So whenever sources are coming directly from the government and not people who are experiencing this phenomenon or this event, we need to be wary about what is happening and what they are saying. Sorry, my screen is going a little wonky there. So here you're going to see some articles looking at the Vietnam War and what was happening as far as the draft and people trying to get out of the draft and people criticizing the war. Then another one, has your news been framed? So your news is always written within a context of a conflict. So a conflict structure their stories is often played about what one group fighting with another group. Another framework is consensus, showing an agreement between groups. Another one is reaction, which just gives snapshots of how different people are reacting and feeling to a news article. Another one is the wrongdoing, showing where corruption or injustice is revealed. And the next one is the straightforward news account, just simply answers who, what, when, where, why, and how, and doesn't get into any of the other, or attempts not to. So here we're going to look at different things. Bush says race-based school policy is flawed. Bush attacks University of Michigan policy. This is again going back to an article we saw earlier about affirmative action. So news frames and news information can shift over time. So one newspaper could have the same article, the same idea framed in two different contexts. So take a look at the framing of the context. How is it framed? Is it framed as a consensus? Is it framed as a conflict? Is it a reaction? How is the news framed? And finally, our sources. And I know you've already seen a short thing from John Green on this and looked at sources. But what sources are cited? Is there similarity in different articles as to the sources cited? Does the reporter even tell you where they got their sources? According to military officials, said a U.S. official, we don't even know who these people are. We're just assuming that it's people who really are in the military. And notice, when you go through the story, every source is from the U.S. military. There's no information coming from anybody else who was there and might have seen what was happening. So there's no mention of outside sources. So be very wary when all the sources are coming from one area. There was a neat paper done a couple years ago talking about where news information is coming from. So routine news information, official proceedings, and press conferences, these are things given by the government, accounts for 24 plus 12. So 36% of our news comes from what the government is telling us. We need to make sure we're questioning that information and ensuring that our news is unbiased. So you're going to be taking a look at now bias in the news, and you're going to be looking at one article coming from 3 different sites, and it is Amazon. They wanted to form a union in Alabama and it was denied, and you're going to look at 3 different sources examining this, and you're going to be going through and you're going to be looking at the word choice, the omissions, the limiting debate, the story framing, and the sources found in each of these articles, and comparing them, being able to see how they're different and similar. And then you're going to use that information, things that you're learning, and you're going to be pulling your own news source and doing the same thing, looking for bias in that as well and evaluating it. So if you have any questions, just contact me and let me know how I can help you.